This recording is for Marine Biology Module 13, and we are still working our way through different areas of the ocean. So this module is going to cover the area that is called the epipelagic zone. So let's go ahead and define some terms. So first of all, the pelagic zone would be all the water in the ocean except a thin layer on the bottom. And then the uppermost layer of the pelagic zone is the epipelagic. Okay, so the uppermost layer, so the epipelagic is the uppermost layer of the pelagic zone. So generally the upper, so epi means top. So if you just think about it, it's the top layer of the pelagic zone, and generally it's down to about a depth of about 650 feet. Okay, so it still goes down to a fairly large depth, but it is the top layer. So if we look at a picture here, so this is the picture, that a similar picture that we've looked at before, but what I want to point out is that the epipelagic zone is just this top layer. Okay, so just this top layer right here. Now this shows it at 200 meters. It can be deeper than that, but it's the top layer of the top layer of water in the ocean. Now, you could also refer to this as the photic zone. However, so remember, the photic zone is where light can penetrate. The photic zone may be the exact same area as the epipelagic zone. However, the photic zone could be smaller than the epipelagic zone, like in areas where there's less intense sunlight. or where the water isn't clear. Okay, so let me say that again. So the photic zone and the epipelagic zone may be the exact same area, because generally in the epipelagic zone, that's going to be the area where light can penetrate. However, in areas of the world where there is less intense sunlight, or where the water is cloudy and isn't clear, then the photic zone would be smaller than the epipelagic zone. So again, if we go back and look at our picture, so this is the epipelagic zone, and we've said that generally this would also be the photic zone, because light would be able to penetrate to that depth as well. But just realize that there are exceptions, so that if the sunlight is not intense enough, it may not be able to penetrate the whole epipelagic zone, or if the water is cloudy in here, then the photic zone, the epipelagic zone, would not necessarily be a photic zone. Okay, so I hope that's clear. The other thing you'll see here is that we have two divisions of the epipelagic zone, and those divisions are called the neritic zone and the oceanic zone. So within the epipelagic zone, the neritic zone is that area that is over the continental shelf. So the last module we studied the continental shelf. So within the epipelagic zone, within that top layer, the part that covers the continental shelf, so this is all continental shelf before you get that drop off, that would be called the neritic zone. And then the rest of it, so the area that's over the rest of the ocean, is the oceanic epipelagic. Okay, so it's epipelagic, so it's just this top layer, but it is the part that extends beyond the area of the continental shelf. Now, you'll see that the layer that is below the epipelagic is called the mesopelagic, or meso. So the area right below the epipelagic is called the mesopelagic. And in terms of light, the very top layer of the mesopelagic, you might get some light, but generally, so maybe in the very, very, very top, light might be able to penetrate, but this area would definitely be considered dark, and certainly anything below the mesopelagic area would be dark. Okay, so you may get some light at the top of the mesopelagic, but below that there would be darkness. Okay, so one of the things we have to think about when we think of this epipelagic zone. Okay, so we're just going to be focusing on the epipelagic. So what are the things that we need to think about? Okay, so first of all, there's no bottom. Okay, so it's that top layer of water. So there is no bottom. So what's going to happen to waste in that area? Well, the waste is going to settle to the bottom. And feed the communities that live there. So, in other words, in this area, because there's no bottom, there are going to be no deposit feeders because nothing gets deposited in this area. So no deposit feeders will be in this area, but there will be suspension feeders. We talked about both of those terms last module. So deposit feeders feed off the stuff that has settled to the bottom. There is no bottom, so there won't be any deposit feeders living in the epipelagic zone, but there will be suspension feeders because suspension feeders are those animals that are able to eat the food that is suspended in the water. Okay, so no deposit feeders, but there will be suspension feeders. In the neritic epipelagic, okay, so again, that's the area over the continental shelf. In this area, you will get a lot of photosynthesis. And you will also get nutrients that come in from estuaries and coral reefs. Because those are going to be nearby. So you will get photosynthesis occurring in the epipelagic zone, and you will get nutrients from estuaries and coral reefs. So in the neritic epipelagic, there is going to be a lot of food sources available. But then when we look at the oceanic epipelagic, and now what can we say about that? Well, there is no outside input of nutrients. Because there are no nearby ecosystems that they can get food from. So this area all the food in this area has to be self-produced. So this is a really important part of information for the oceanic epipelagic, because there are no nutrients that come in from the outside. There's no nearby ecosystems for them to get food. The food has to be self-produced. So how does that happen? Well, this area is actually very good at making So I'm just going to write this up here again to remind us that we're still talking about the oceanic epipelagic. This area is very good at producing. And in fact, this area is so good at producing that it makes more than the organisms that live there can use, and so it can supply other areas as well. So it makes more than organisms living here can use. So it supplies other areas as well. Okay, so even though there is no outside input in terms of its food supply, this area of the ocean is very good at producing. And so then the next question will be, well, how? Well, the answer to that is that phytoplankton are present in very large numbers. So these phytoplankton, so they make their own food through photosynthesis. Because these phytoplankton are present in such large numbers, these phytoplankton actually produce half of Earth's oxygen. Okay, so phytoplankton produce half of the oxygen supply in Earth's atmosphere. So they are very, very good at being producers. Now, this figure I want to show you is just, so these are different types of phytoplankton. I'm not going to ask you these words, but they're all small. So these are all microscopic. So the microplankton are those that are 200 down to 20 micrometers. This is a micrometer, a millionth of a meter. Then these are 20 down to 5 micrometers, 5 to 2 micrometers, and these are less than 2. So they are very, very small, and but they are plentiful, so that they are able to produce a lot of oxygen. Now, other organisms these are organisms that are present in nutrient poor water. They are able to use these types of organisms tend to be able to thrive and survive in water that is poor, doesn't have a lot of nutrients in it. But I put this up here because they are an example of nanoplankton. So they're in terms of size, they would be in this general area. Okay, so let's go ahead and go back now, and so we want to switch gears now a little bit, and we're going to talk about the epipelagic zooplankton. Okay, so their primary food source would be phytoplankton. They may be herbivores, so the zooplankton may be herbivores, which means they would just be eating phytoplankton. Or they may be carnivores, meaning that they eat other zooplankton. So the reason that we think about the food that is being eaten by organisms is because we want to be able to trace the energy and see that energy is not lost. So we would have, in terms of energy, you're going to have very small phytoplankton. And the energy that is contained within that very small phytoplankton, that phytoplankton gets eaten by very small protozoa. Which are zooplankton. Okay, so in other words, the energy that was contained within the phytoplankton now has gotten transferred to the protozoa. So that's one of the reasons we talk about what's being eaten by what, is to be able to trace the energy transfer within those organisms. Also, in terms of zooplankton, there are organisms that are called copepods. I'll show you a picture here in a moment. So these are members of class Crustacea. They're crustaceans. They're bigger than protozoa. So remember, these are zooplankton. So they're animals, but they're planktonic. They can't swim. They float along. So they're larger than protozoa, and they eat the phytoplankton, and also smaller than themselves, zooplankton. So again, the energy from the phytoplankton and the smaller zooplankton then gets passed through the food chain in this way. So let me show you a picture of some of these. So here are some pictures of different types of copepods. So one of the things you'll see is that some of them, many of them have these bristled appendages. So see these appendages that have bristles on them? Up here, these are all bristled appendages. So copepods have bristled appendages. And if you think about it, you might realize that they use them to cause water to flow near their mouths. Or they, some of them are kind of claw-like, so they will actually use those to grasp their prey. Okay, so let's go back and look at that picture again. So you can imagine that these appendages moving in the water could pull water toward them, and then they would therefore be able to extract the food, the phytoplankton and smaller zooplankton from that water, or they can use these appendages to actually grasp on to the food, like they can hang on to it like a claw. So those are the copepods. Another organism that we would find are called the larvaceans. Okay, so the interesting thing about these organisms are that they are covered in mucus, and they use that to capture their food. I'll show you a picture again in just a moment. So some of them have a tail that they use to pull water in, and then as the water flows over the mucus, that mucus is able to capture the very small particles. Sometimes they have a filter system, and those filters can get clogged if the particles are too large, and when that happens, they just shed their mucus coating and they will get a new one. So the old mucus that they shed becomes sinks to the bottom, and it will become food for other organisms that live below them. So let's go ahead and look at a picture of the larvation. So this is a larvacean. This is a diagram, and then this is an actual picture of one. So they actually use this tail-like organism to pull water in over them, and then they are covered in the mucus, and the mucus is able to capture plankton, either phytoplankton or smaller zooplankton, and then if that filter area gets clogged because the particles are too large, they just shed it, and that then becomes, they shed it and get a new one, and the old one sinks to the bottom, becomes food for other organisms. This mucus net that they spread out, so this is like a mucus net that they spread out, it can be about 2 meters long. So 2 yardsticks essentially long, so it can be quite large. Another organism still talking about the zooplankton. Another organism that you will see that is zooplankton, so we're still talking about zooplankton in the epipelagic zone. There are structures that are organisms that are called pteropods. And these organisms have a foot that looks like a wing, looks and acts like a wing. So in other words, they move this foot up and down, and as they do that, they feed on phytoplankton and zooplankton. So let's go ahead and look at a picture of one of those. So here, this is actually a drawing of a pteropod. So they're plankton. They're zooplankton. So they use these wing-like. They move those up to move through the water, and as they do that, then they feed on phytoplankton and on zooplankton that is smaller than they are. Now, keep in mind that not all plankton are small, because we've said already. So let me just emphasize that we've talked here about very small plankton, but not all plankton are small. So remember, planktonic just means that they don't have a means of swimming against the current. They just are moved along with the current. So jellyfish is an example of a large plankton. We talked about comb jellies. They are large. A Portuguese man of war. So although we have been talking about very small microscopic plankton, just remember that there are large plankton as well. The thing about plankton is that about 95% of their body is water. And what that does, because they are made of so much water, their density is close to the density of seawater. And therefore, they are able to stay afloat without using much energy. So organisms that need to move themselves through the water, they expend a lot of energy to do that, whereas plankton are able to do it without expending much energy. Now, in terms of plankton, there are some other words that we use. The first one is called holoplankton. And holoplankton, although these are plankton that spend their entire lives as plankton. So most of the organisms that we have talked about today are holoplankton. And then the term meroplankton is used for organisms that, so this is zooplankton, that spend only part of their life as plankton. So when would you see, or what are some examples of meroplankton? Well, there are many fish and invertebrates that go through a larval phase. So their larval phase would be planktonic. And when they are in this phase, they eat phytoplankton and zooplankton. But then when they become adults, then they are no longer in the planktonic phase. Okay, so meroplankton is those that spend part of their lives as plankton. And the other part, the rest of their lives, they are not plankton. So let's review this term here. Nectonic means that they are able to swim against the currents. So in the epipelagic zone, just like there, we've already talked about the plankton that are in that area, there are also nectonic creatures, nectonic animals that live in this area. So what would those be? There would be adult fish. Okay, so they live in the epipelagic zone, but they're nectonic. Marine mammals. That live in the epipelagic zone and are nectonic. So those would be two big ones. Also you can get large mammals like baleen whales or whale sharks. So there are a wide variety of nectonic animals living within the epipelagic zone. One example that I believe I have a picture of. So here is a school of anchovies. So these small fish that swim in schools would eat zooplankton. So they are, again, they live in the epipelagic zone, but they are nectonic, and so they would eat zooplankton in that area. Let's talk a little bit, let's say a few things about the predators. So what about epipelagic predators? So animals that are predators that live in the epipelagic zone. Some of them live below the epipelagic zone, but they come up at night to feed. And generally, the epipelagic predators are not picky eaters, so they're typically small fish that eat plankton and other small fish. And generally, the epipelagic predators, the size of the prey is proportional to the size of the predator. And that makes sense. So in other words, the predators within this area, you would get small fish, would eat plankton and other small fish. And then larger fish would eat medium fish. And then the largest fish would eat the largest prey. So that's what we mean by the fact that the size of the prey is proportional to the size of the predator. So, for example, so you might get like a large shark eating a marlin. Or some other large fish. So the epipelagic predators eat food proportional to their size. So how do you stay afloat? How do these animals stay afloat in the epipelagic zone? Okay, so these, the animals who live here, there are some factors that could make them sink. So why would they sink? Why would they tend to sink and not stay within the epipelagic zone? Well, some of them have a higher density than water. I know we just said that the plankton don't, but they have a higher density than water because they have things like shells, they have scales, they have bones, and all of those things would make it easy for them to sink. They also need to stay in the area where they can do photosynthesis. So they need to stay there. So they need to stay where they can do photosynthesis. And they need to stay where they can get food. So these are reasons that even though they might have a tendency to sink, they need to stay in the area of the epipelagic zone so that they can do photosynthesis or that they can stay where their food source is. So how do they do this? Well, one thing that they do is that they can increase their resistance in water. So that they sink more slowly. So in other words, that this means that they want to create more drag. And one of the ways that they do that is that they can act like a parachute where they have a higher volume or a higher surface area per volume. So if you think about a parachute, when you spread out that parachute, it catches the air. Well, this would be a similar thing, but it's going to catch the water so that they will move more slowly through the water. They're going to sink slower, sink more slowly. So many of these organisms are also flat. And if you put a flat thing in the water, it tends to zigzag as it sinks. And so it's going to take them longer for it to sink. So that gives them more time. It takes more time for them to sink so they can stay afloat more easily. So this takes more time to sink. So they will more likely to stay afloat. And then in addition to these things, many of the, especially phytoplankton, will have projections on them or things that stick out on them. And those projections or protrusions make them sink more slowly. So all of these factors can help them to be able to stay closer to stay in the epipelagic zone so that they can do photosynthesis and so that they can stay there to get food. Let me see if I have a picture of Um, I don't know if I have one that has projections on them. I guess I don't, but there are, many of the plankton will have projections or protrusions from the bodies that give them increased resistance in the water. So that's one way, is they can do things to increase the resistance in the water. A second thing that they can do is they can do things to help them swim better. So if they increase their buoyancy, they don't have to swim so hard to stay within the area, so they don't have to expend as much energy. So what are some ways that they do this? One way is that some of the organisms can store oil or fats in their body. So they'll actually have an oil drop that they store in their body, often in the liver. And remember, you'll see, if you haven't already, the shark stores oil and secretes oil from its liver. Other animals do that as well, and that helps them to stay afloat. And then, sort of related to this, some animals also have blubber, which helps them to stay afloat. In biology, you may have learned that many fish have a structure that is called a swim bladder, that they inflate with air to help them stay afloat. There are some plankton that live right at the surface, and they will have a structure that they fill with air that helps them to stay right at the surface. So some plankton live right at the surface. And they have a gas-filled structure that helps them to stay at the surface. So that structure will just fill with gas and allow them then to stay right at the surface where they live. I guess the only other one that I will mention in this category in terms of how they stay swimming, there is a type of sea slug that actually swallows a bubble of air. And then they are able to stay on the surface. So there are a variety of ways, mostly related to air and oil, that allow these organisms to be able to swim without expending large amounts of energy. The interesting thing about this sea slug is that they actually will eat prey that sting, and then when they eat that prey, they actually incorporate into themselves some of the stinging cells, so that then they have protection from other organisms as well. So we've got about 10 more minutes. Let's see. Let's talk a little bit about how do they find food. So in the epipelagic zone, what do they do to find prey? So how do they locate their prey? Well, zooplankton, they have ways that they can detect. They are able to detect movement. They can discern shapes and shadows. So they're, we would think of them as being a pretty, not a very complicated organism, but they still have ways to do that. Many large fish have good vision, and well, not just large fish, but even marine mammals. They have very good eyesight. And they will use that eyesight to find prey and also to find a mate. If we were to look at the optic lobe of their brain, we would find that it's relative to the size of the brain, they would have a large optic lobe of the brain. So those are two ways. Another way that we've already talked about, I think, in the shark we talked about it. So they also use their lateral line. So remember that senses vibration and movement, senses vibration, and they can use that to locate prey. And then the other thing that we talked about was echolocation. I'm not going to say a lot about that because you know what it is, but they will also use echolocation to find food in the epipelagic zone. So that one thing they have to be able to do is find food in order to live in the epipelagic zone. So that deals with them trying to find prey. What about how do they hide? So if they are, how do they hide from predators? So if they are the prey, what techniques do they have to be protected from predators? Well, some of them, we've already talked about camouflage. And we looked at that previously. Or some of them will have no color at all. So many of these would be either like a blue or a silver color to blend in. And then a technique that is used a lot is something that is called counter shading. And with counter shading, the dorsal side is usually dark, so their upper side is dark, and the ventral side is like silver or white. So when they are viewed from above, you can't see them because they're dark. With the water on top of them, you can't see them because they're dark. And when they're viewed from the bottom, they blend in with the bottom as well. So counter shading is a very effective way for them to escape detection from predators. Many of them are also have the ability to swim very quickly. So if we look at their bodies, a lot of times they have a flattened shape, and that allows them to swim faster. They don't have things coming off their body, so they don't have projections. So that would allow them to swim faster. Many of the organisms in many of the fish here either have small scales or no scales. So they can move through the water more easily. The scales are going to scales will create some resistance. So in the epipelagic area, they often have small scales or no scales, so they move through the water easily. And their fins are often stiff and narrow. And that they use that for steering. They use those fins for steering. So all of those things would be important for them to be able to swim quickly through the water and escape predators. Let me mention just one more thing and then we'll be done. So there is something that is called vertical migration. Also related to their feeding patterns. So there are organisms that will move to lower depths during the day. And of course, during the day is peak feeding time. So they will drop down to a lower depth. They'll drop down to where it's darker. And then that means that there is not enough light for predators to see them. So they escape predators by moving into a dark area during the peak feeding time of the predators, and then at night they would then they would move back up to the epipelagic zone. They would move back to the surface and they would eat phytoplankton and zooplankton. Okay, so that's one that's called vertical migration, and they just their way of escaping from predators is to move somewhere else during the peak feeding time of the predators, and then which is during the day, and then at night they themselves would move back up closer to the surface so that they can feed. Okay, so we are out of time. We did not get through everything in that module, but you got enough. We got enough to give you an idea about factors to consider for organisms living within the epipelagic zone. Okay, so we will stop there.